It was the fall of 1997 when three young hitchhikers found themselves stranded on a winding, snow-covered road deep in the Alaska mountains. Sarah, Josh, and Ethan had been traveling across the country, seeking adventure and freedom. The crisp air and towering peaks of the Alaskan wilderness had called to them like a siren song, but as the days passed, they began to realize just how isolated and unforgiving the land could be. The trio had been on their way to Fairbanks when they were dropped off by a trucker, who warned them that there was a stretch of road up ahead where few people ventured. "Be careful up there," he'd said, eyes wide with a fear they couldn't quite place. Not many folks come back from those mountains. The hitchhikers, eager to press on, had dismissed his warning. They were young, full of energy, and ready for whatever the world could throw at them. Little did they know, the mountains had something waiting for them, something they weren't prepared to face. As they walked along the snow-laden path, the towering evergreens seemed to close in around them. The sky had been overcast for hours, a thick gray blanket that made everything look distant and indistinct. The wind had picked up, and the air had turned frigid, cutting through their jackets and seeping into their bones. They hadn't seen a car in hours, and they began to wonder if they were truly as alone as they felt. By late afternoon, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. The trail had become more treacherous, and the trio had begun to slow down, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. The only sounds now were the occasional rustle of the trees and the wind whistling through the peaks above. "Maybe we should set up camp here," Josh suggested, looking around nervously. "It's getting too dark to keep walking." "I agree," Sarah replied. "We'll be exposed out here if we keep going. We'll huddle together and start a fire." The three found a small clearing just off the trail and set up a modest camp. They built a fire, its warm glow flickering against the growing chill. But as the fire crackled and they huddled around it, a strange unease settled over them. It wasn't just the cold. It was something deeper, a feeling of being watched. Ethan, who had always been the skeptic, was the first to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. The others fell silent, straining their ears. The wind had died down, and for a moment, all they could hear was the crackling of the fire. Then, from the darkness beyond the trees, a distant thudding sound echoed. It was rhythmic, like heavy footsteps stomping through the snow, slowly moving closer. Josh stood up, his breath visible in the air, and looked into the trees. "It's probably just a moose or something," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Sarah and Ethan weren't so sure. The footsteps continued, and this time, they were louder, closer. The trio's unease grew into something sharper, more primal. Then, a low growl rumbled from the forest, a deep, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. It was unlike anything they had ever heard before, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth itself. "That's not a moose," Ethan whispered. "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could respond, a massive shadow moved at the edge of the trees, just beyond the light of their fire. It was tall, unbelievably tall, its silhouette looming against the darkness. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, colder, as the figure approached. And then they saw it. A creature emerged from the shadows, its enormous form towering over them. It was covered in thick, matted fur, its eyes glowing like embers in the night. Its face was grotesque, a twisted mix of human and animal features, with a wide, gaping mouth and sharp teeth visible in the dim light. Its arms hung low, almost brushing the snow, and its large, powerful hands gripped the trunks of the trees as it moved forward. A chill of terror surged through the group as they realized what they were looking at. "It's Bigfoot," Sarah breathed, her voice barely a whisper. The creature's gaze locked onto them, and in that instant, they knew it wasn't interested in anything but them. The growl grew louder, and the ground seemed to tremble with each step the creature took. The air was thick with fear. Josh grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her back. "Run," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. Without thinking, they bolted in the opposite direction, their footsteps clumsy in the snow, their hearts pounding. Behind them, they could hear the creature's massive steps following, its growls reverberating through the air like a thunderstorm on the horizon. They didn't look back as they ran, but the sound of its pursuit never stopped. It was close. Too close. Every time they thought they might have gained some distance, the growls grew louder, closer. The mountain was swallowing them whole, and all they could do was run. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they stumbled into a small, decrepit cabin hidden deep within the forest. They forced the door open, their breath coming in ragged gasps, and slammed it shut behind them. Inside, it was dark and cold, but it was shelter. They locked the door, huddling together in the center of the room. They waited, trembling, listening as the growls faded into the distance. The creature was no longer at the door, but they knew it wasn't gone. It was still out there, watching, waiting. For hours, they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire in the corner and the howling wind outside. But the feeling of being watched never left them. When morning finally came, the sun broke through the clouds, casting pale light across the landscape. They didn't speak much as they left the cabin and began the long walk back down the mountain. They had seen enough. The fear had etched itself into their bones, and they knew they would never forget what they had encountered in those mountains. None of them ever spoke of it again. And yet, every year, when the snow began to fall and the mountains grew silent, they couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was still watching them from the shadows of the Alaskan wilderness.